Home rule. You've probably never heard of it, and it affects everything in this damn state. The history of discrimination in Alabama has often raised national consciousness of racial inequality across the Southeast. From Bloody Sunday, to the Schoolhouse Stand, to the Children's Crusade, the Freedom Riders, and the Montgomery bus boycott, the national character of Alabama has been defined by its history of racial segregation, disenfranchisement, and slavery. As well we should be. But unknown to many an Alabamian, and most everyone beyond Dixie, we constitute the most anti-democratic regime of state governance in the United States. This is a look at the many implications home rule reform would have on democracy and racial equality. It's time to reconstitute Alabama. Home rule is a nebulous term that represents the negotiation of powers between local and state governments. Different states allow their local governments different kinds of freedoms, powers, and rights, which means tackling this problem for any state requires diving deep into the specificities of state history and law. Knowing what we know about Alabama's culture and our predominant conservative ideology, you might be forgiven for assuming Alabama follows through on its values of individualism, self-determination, and the virtues of small government. But as we'll see in this documentary, our Constitution instead embodies centralized authority, inefficiency, and it manufactures our consent to be governed accordingly. The topic of home rule intersects many others, from the long-standing issues of suffrage to taxation policy, to the mechanics of local elections and structure of local governments. It goes all the way down to the state Congress and our individual representatives. Alabama's restrictions on home rule were set in place for two reasons: to keep power in the hands of the state's richest whites, and above all else, make the black population powerless under their control. But before we can dive into those specifics, we have to form the greater context that surrounds the issues as they stand. Revising the Alabama Constitution has been floating around state politics for as long as our Constitution has been in place. In the 1930s, gubernatorial candidate Big Jim Folsom ran on a platform that decried the Constitutions for its misrepresentation of the state's poor. Unfortunately, every time the issue comes to the forefront of Alabama's political consciousness, the state legislature strikes down any attempt at revision at the behest of Alabama's moneyed interests. Finally, in 2020, among the many local constitutional amendments on the Alabama ballot was a provision to recompile the Alabama Constitution. The measure passed with a 2/3 majority, which indicates that the people of Alabama know our Constitution is misconceived. But recompilation is not revision, and this referendum does nothing to restructure our government nor reduce its inefficiencies. In fact, recompiling our Constitution will better protect it from further attempts at revision without fixing any of its functional problems. The recompilation grants the legislature power to consolidate and organize its amendments, delete some old, irrelevant provisions, and remove its racist language, which only serves to disguise the government's discriminatory structure without changing anything. Not to mention, the only way to restore democratic values is to take the job out of the hands of the legislature. What a white thing to do. That's the context as it stands today. But as with any discussion of race and government in the South, we must also take a step back to every Southerner's favorite event to rehash, re-narrate, and revise: the Civil War. That's right, we're talking the War of Northern Aggression, in which the South shot first, or the war between the states, right to own slaves, whichever you prefer. Now, whether or not the war was fought over slavery, I don't care. But what is clear is the fact that the war ended slavery. Oh, what's this? This is the Constitution of the United States, a clean, precise, if a little racist document that provides the supreme law of the land. And within this document, the Civil War furnished 3 constitutional amendments: the 13th, outlawing slavery; the 14th, which among other things provides citizenship to freedmen; and the 15th, which guarantees the right to vote regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. While the Northern occupation furthered the good fight for African American representation in government, these amendments presented a right mess to the white supremacists of Alabama. So when it came to readmitting Alabama to the United States, The first of a long series of anti-democratic battles would play out at the foundation of Alabama law, our Constitution. And the ramifications of these embittered Confederates' ideals are felt throughout the state to this day. Following the war, the Grant administration required the Southern states to write and ratify new constitutions under the supervision of the Northern occupation. When it came to Alabama, the 1868 Reconstruction Constitution was perceived to be the work of carpetbaggers, scalawags, and, worst of all, Republicans. So the document failed to ratify with a popular referendum, and rather than rework or fix the document or its public perception, the Grant administration just decided to remove the majority referendum requirement, and they forced Alabama under the governance of the 1868 Constitution. The following 7 years of Alabama politics became a literal battleground as white Democrats tried to claw their way back to political control using force and fraud. For instance, the whites in Barber County would stand outside polling stations with shotguns to turn away African Americans. Other counties in the Black Belt managed to elect and bribe registrars such that anyone, black or white, could vote as they please, but they'd just count it for the Democrats anyway. This method of transferring black votes into white votes became such an elegant and unspoken system of tyranny that it controlled state politics for the rest of the 19th century, and would be used as the means to ratify both the 1875 and 1901 constitutions. Notice that I located this system of fraud in the Black Belt. For those who don't know, the Black Belt is the middle section of our state, named once for its fertile soil and now as a demographic signifier. This stretch in antebellum was Alabama's plantation country, and as a result maintained the largest and densest population of Alabama's African Americans under the control of the state's smallest and richest white population. These plantation owners were called Bourbons, and they depended on tyranny over the black race to maintain their economic and political power. While slavery of course existed in the hill and wiregrass countries to the north and south, those portions of the state hosted far smaller populations of African Americans, and their economic activity was centered on small subsistence farming rather than the plantation cash crop model that exported cotton and tobacco. While most white people in these portions of the state were loyal to the Democratic Party, they often disagreed with the economic policies of the Bourbons, who controlled the party's agenda. Furthermore, as the Industrial Revolution caught up with the state, Birmingham exploded, and the newly wealthy industrialists of the cities allied themselves with Bourbon interests because their mining and manufacturing businesses also depended on exploiting the labor of African Americans. Republicans were scattered throughout the state and were supported by the black population. But once the occupation ended, the Democrats' agenda of force and fraud usurped control of the Black Belt, and in so doing invalidated the voting power of African Americans. This brings us to 1875, which marked the year when Democrats regained control of the Alabama legislature, and they immediately called a constitutional convention to shirk the imposition of the 1868 document. However, while writing the new Constitution, the delegates feared explicitly white supremacist language would again cause federal intervention. So the 1875 Constitution bolstered the bureaucracy of the Democratic Party, which means the state's electoral tradition of coercion and fraud went from definitely illegal to only kind of sort of illegal, because white supremacy. While this constitution didn't directly push widespread disenfranchisement, it laid down many of the restrictions on home rule that we are talking about today, and it left plenty of room in its language to legislate disenfranchisement down the line. For instance, in 1894, Alabama faced a populist revolt that threatened to divide the Democratic Party's voting bloc. So Bourbons pushed through the Sayre election law, which began the state's descent into the legal disenfranchisement of its population by means of literacy tests and property ownership requirements. The United States, 1868, 1875, and this is our 1901 Constitution. This is our Constitution today, and it was written with the express intent of securing Bourbon control of the government. Ours is the longest constitutional document in the world, only rivaled by India's constitution because theirs is translated into multiple languages. At 315,000 words, it is 40 times longer than the U.S. Constitution, 12 times longer than the average states, and longer than Florida's, Georgia's, Tennessee's, and Mississippi's combined. Why is our Constitution the longest in the world? Because it was designed to perform local government by constitutional amendment. No joke, of the more than 900 amendments, over 65% of them apply to one county or municipality in the state. For instance, 34 allows Limestone County to impose a tax to pay for malaria control. Amendment 482 enables Lauderdale County to dispose of dead farm animals. And Amendment 502 allows Morgan County to have a sheriff's posse. All of this being governed at the foundation of our law is ridiculous. There are better ways to administer local governance. This process is fundamentally anti-democratic, and when it comes to tyranny in the South, we all know who's getting stepped on. And with that, we have finally come to a point of direct relevance, because this is our Constitution. It is our government in 2021. Home rule isn't a right in the way that the Bill of Rights prescribes our freedoms of religion, speech, and guns. One federal judge, Thomas Cooley, suggested that the people have an inherent right to local self-government, which, I mean, is like, talk to me, Daddy Cooley. This inherent right is known as Cooley's doctrine and is often used as the counter-argument to the more widely implemented doctrine of Dillon's rule. Federal Judge John Dillon ruled in 1872 that local governments have no rights that are not explicitly afforded them by the state government. Dillon's rule is measured in degrees of power and is backed up in part by the Supreme Court, but even more so in state constitutions. Alabama boasts one of the strictest implementations of Dillon's rule, and this constitution tramples any hope for home rule in Alabama. In order to regain our right to self-determination, we must understand the many interdependent ways this document restricts our communities. But to read this document alone does not provide us the context necessary to fully understand the implications of its mechanisms, especially if we remove its racist language. Luckily for us, the months-long deliberation of the 1901 Constitutional Convention in Montgomery was recorded verbatim in a more than 5,000-page document where our ex-Confederates and young white supremacists expressed their real intentions behind each and every clause of the Constitution. I am glad to say, however, Mr. President, that we differ not upon the end to be reached, but upon the method or means to be employed. We understand our commission from the people exactly alike, and that was that the ballot and its exalted privileges should be taken from the unworthy, incapable, and vicious, and that its free, fair, and full exercise should be secured to those who appreciate its responsibilities, and who will be trustworthy in discharging the sacred obligation which it imposes. We recall the fact that in the very outset we were confronted with two barriers directly opposed to each other. One was the 15th article of the Federal Constitution, which declares that the right of a citizen of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The 14th Amendment having declared before that time that the Negro was a citizen and a citizen of the state wherein he resided, this provision shielded him as such from discrimination and attack. The Democratic platform by which we were pledged to abide, and on the other hand, declared that no white man shall be deprived of the right to vote, except on conviction of infamous crime. Were men ever placed in a more narrow or tortuous channel through which to guide the ship of state? Mr. President and delegates, I have faced responsibilities from my childhood until now. I saw the storm clouds gathering when I was a boy in the political horizon of my country. I met the advancing column of the enemy formed in double line when we were deployed at 10 paces apart and were armed with pot metal guns, while the enemy were armed with Spencer rifles in the last battle of the war on Alabama soil. Men of my company, 17, composed of 30, left dead or mortally wounded upon the field in 5 minutes. I never felt more serious then than I feel today. In my young manhood, I saw Reconstruction with all of its horrors. I saw the white men of my state placed under the domination and the heel of the black race. I saw the time when white men had no rights respected by them. It was then, sir, in my town in another state, the White League was formed of 3 men, and I had the fortune to be one of the 3. Reconstitute, Alabama. Throughout this documentary, I will begin to untangle the web of policy and structure that this document weaves in its restrictions of home rule. And as I do so, it's important to keep in mind that its complexity was arbitrarily contrived to make us ignorant of its process, and as a result, place political power squarely in the hands of the Bourbon and corporate elite. When the 1901 Constitutional Convention was called, the delegates made one particular promise that we'll see debated up and down: that the new Constitution should disenfranchise African Americans while maintaining suffrage for 100% of white voters. The fact that we are here, the fact that this Committee on Suffrage had imposed upon it the duty of reframing our fundamental law, so far as suffrage is concerned, is the result of a great movement of public opinion in Alabama. That public opinion has become clear and defined on certain propositions. One of those propositions is that the right to vote should be taken away from certain citizens who under existing law now possesses that right. Another proposition is that the right to vote should not be taken away from a large body of citizens who under the existing law possesses that right and have used it in the interest of social order, security, and progress. Our mission here is to strike at the evil in our electoral system and to let what is good in it remain as it is. Reconstitute, Alabama. The delegates went to great semantic lengths to feel as though they upheld this general promise. But the fact is, the only way to disenfranchise black voters without breaking the terms of the 15th Amendment was to disenfranchise poor people. The 1901 Constitution wound up disenfranchising 600,000 whites, along with the black population of Alabama. If your family came from anywhere but the upper crust of Alabama society, chances are you weren't represented for the better part of the 20th century. As we discussed with the Sarah election law, literacy tests were a popular targeted method of discrimination, but the delegates saw them as rather short-sighted. There has been a misapprehension from the beginning. We say that any man who can read or write, or own a certain amount of property, can vote. When then would be the condition in this state? Let us take the census of the United States. We find, for instance, in the county of Dallas, there are 2,088 white people who are literate, and 3,184 Negroes that are literate. So in Marengo and in all of the counties of the Black Belt, you find that the Negroes who can register and vote under your clause will outnumber the white people. Reconstitute, Alabama. The goals of the convention were threefold: limit taxation, disenfranchise black voters, and provide public education. Because of the latter two, literacy tests alone were determined a self-defeating mechanism. The framers settled instead on 5 gates through which the Constitution would provide suffrage: a poll tax, literacy tests, land ownership, the grandfather clause, and a character clause. The poll tax seems particularly ironic based on Alabama's prevailing anti-taxation ideology, but when Mr. O'Neill discusses it, he makes it clear that this isn't a mandatory tax in the way that property or income taxes are. The gentleman says we are under pledge not to increase taxation. What is taxation? A contribution to the support of the government. Is this a forced contribution? No man is obliged to pay it unless he choose to do so. There is another proposition. The gentleman from Tuscaloosa talks about the pledge which we made to the people of Alabama in reference to taxation. What I ask the convention is the paramount pledge to the people of Alabama. It is to secure permanent white supremacy in this state. And are we going to violate that pledge? Everybody knows that illiteracy among the Negro race is rapidly declining. Everybody knows that unless we put some additional safeguard around this provision, which authorizes every Negro who can read and write to vote, the Black Belt, if the vote is counted as cast, will be under Negro domination. Are we to take the opinion of those of us from the white counties, when every man who represents a county in the Black Belt this morning, with the solemn responsibility resting upon him, stated before that committee that this provision was absolutely essential to the preservation of white supremacy in that portion of Alabama? Reconstitute Alabama. If paying to vote doesn't seem bad enough, then consider that the poll tax was to be collected each year, regardless of election cycle. So failing to pay between election cycles in your 20s meant you wouldn't again be eligible to vote until you reached 45 years old. The justification that the tax is voluntary discriminates against the poor by centering money as the source of political participation. Combine that with the economic inequalities brought by sharecropping and landlessness, and the delegates have found a way to disenfranchise most African Americans without explicitly disenfranchising anyone based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Next, the delegates implemented the Grandfather Clause, which provided the right to vote to all Alabamian soldiers and their descendants. Because they were held in slavery until the end of the war, Black Alabamians had less opportunity to fight for either the Union or Confederacy, and as such, the Grandfather Clause favors suffrage for the white population. The Grandfather Clause was highly contested and debated at the convention. The majority who favored the Grandfather Clause did so on the grounds that it would best maintain white supremacy down the generational line, whereas the minority who opposed the Grandfather Clause thought it too blatant a violation of the 15th Amendment, essentially implementing a system controlled by a political aristocracy, which it did for most of the 20th century. It's why white supremacists today still invent reasons for their ancestors' participation in the war. Mr. President and gentlemen of the convention, I am for the Grandfather Clause as it appears in the majority report, except I am more so. But our history records a grievous error. Our fathers made one mistake which has proven a perpetual handicap to our sunny Southland, and placed it in almost hopeless discord with the other sections of the Union. It was contrary to the principles of freedom and liberty embedded deep in the American heart that slavery should exist in our midst. The Negro, the slave, was not indigenous to our country, nor kindred to our blood. His presence, whether as slave or as freeman, became an element of discord. His enslavement for a time was the only treatment for his existence here. We adopted it, in fact brought him here that he might become a slave. But in doing so, we committed a national sin. Yet, of all our sins, we of the South were more sinned against by our brethren of the North than sinning. They were our partners in the original sin, but they took advantage of the climatic conditions which brought the Negro to the South to wash their hands of him, and then turned upon us to persecute us and destroy us for the very crime they had helped us commit. I challenge all history for an instance of more radical wrong than was their enfranchisement of the freed slave with its accompanying Reconstruction measures. Nothing short of the most intense hatred could have led to it. I do not remember the bitterest of the experiences, nor the gloomiest of the days that followed, as the older delegates here do, but the spirit of my father, who gave first his fortune and then his life to the lost cause, lives in me, and swells my bosom almost to bursting when I remember our wrongs. I agree with the gentlemen who have preceded me that the 15th Amendment contravenes the laws of nature, the lights and teachings of history, and the rules and conditions of liberty itself. Would any gentleman say that the proud eagle, the king of birds, would have accorded to him the full measure of liberty to which he is entitled, if he was brought down from his giddy heights and made to sort with the snipe? Could it be contended that the lion was free, when he enjoyed only the privilege and capacity of locomotion which nature has given to the hedgehog? Can it be contended that we, the proudest and best example and specimen of the world's greatest race, we, the sons of Caucasian fathers, of Saxon and Norman French lineage, the sons of American heroes, enjoy our full measure and right of liberty when we have no more than can be enjoyed by the ebon sons of dark and benighted Africa? Reconstitute, Alabama. The cognitive dissonance and mental gymnastics necessary to justify the convention's restriction of suffrage is mystifying. Finally, in order to vote, the constituent must fit the morality and character clause, which, let's face it, provided language vague enough to justify any registrar looking a black man in his face to say, "Not today." Together, the barriers to suffrage limited overall voter turnout, which favors conservative politics. The 19th Amendment in 1920 and Civil Rights Act of 1964 definitely helped open the polls to women and people of color, but you'd be a fool to think they magically ended discrimination at the polls. This is why Georgia, Alabama, and Texas were closing polling stations, limiting access, and opposed to voting by mail leading up to the 2020 election. The white establishment knows that the only way to maintain power is through anti-democratic policy. Hence the "we're a republic, not a democracy" ideological retort brandished by the Democrats of the 19th century, the same as Republicans in the 21st. Suffrage rights and ballot access define the kinds of candidates we elect. At the national level, we elect our president through the state's electoral college delegation, which itself consolidates our whole vote behind conservative candidates. And we elect our representatives to the U.S. Congress and Senate, who often engage in hollow acts of racism, such as the Southern Manifesto. At the state level, we elect governors, state congressmen, and senators, but we often overlook or ignore the significance of local government elections at the county level. And this is where discrimination develops beyond the simple question of suffrage and refracts into the very mechanisms of our government and representation in Alabama. The level of county politics in Alabama has no structure of authority. The county commission controls the budget of the county's departments, but the leaders of the county's departments are also elected officials who answer only to their constituencies. Electing such specialized and highly skilled positions as sheriff, coroner, and tax assessor opens the entire county government to corruption, fraud, and discrimination. Where a county commissioner may have run to scale back the sheriff's budget in order to reduce policing in black communities, the sheriff may have run tough on crime and the county government would grind to a halt. Having an amateur constituency-motivated coroner creates racially motivated opportunities to cover up lynchings on cause of death reports. There has also been widespread reporting of tax assessors undervaluing property for taxation purposes before the same land would be sold for tens of millions of dollars and developed for corporate enterprising. So long as the moneyed constituencies of the county maintain strangleholds on local offices, the poor and black communities will take on an unfair tax burden.
Now what are we here for? I think, delegates of this convention, that we are here for a higher purpose than has been stated by the gentlemen who have preceded me in the opposition. One of them has said that we are here to purify the ballot. Another has said that we are here to eliminate the vicious and ignorant Negro from the right of suffrage. Both of those propositions are true, but we are here for a still higher purpose. We are here to put upon a permanent basis the elements which will hold our civilization together. And we are here for a still higher purpose, namely, to restore the state of Alabama to its absolutely normal relation to the national government by providing a plan of suffrage and give the Negro also the hope of increasing in proportion and in numbers that right of suffrage, a fair and equitable plan upon which and by which he may, as the years go by, if he has that in him which will capacitate him for self-government, stand in last upon the same footing as the white man, so far as the right to vote is concerned. But insofar as he shows that he is incapacitated, we want it fixed in our law, in our social structure, that he shall be disqualified from voting, that at last, as the final step in that long drama of our tragic history, beginning with the importation into this country of the Negro race, as final scene in that terrific drama, we can say to the world, we have at last been restored completely and fully as an integral part of the most majestic government that ever lived upon the fact of the earth. Reconstitute, Alabama!
In theory, as pathways to voting opened up through the late 20th century, black representation would come naturally from reenfranchisement. But there, too, is a loophole. Rather than elect county officials in the Black Belt, the state transitioned their county authorities to appointment positions at the discretion of the governor, thereby relinquishing control of the Black Belt's local governments to the statewide interests of the white elite. From there, the county governments would divert black tax funding toward white schools, businesses, and communities. That being said, budgeting and directing of funds is about all of the power afforded county governments. Counties must seek a constitutional amendment if neither an explicit constitutional grant of authority or a valid grant of authority by the legislature exist. The Constitution places sole legislative power in the hands of the legislature, which limits the extent to which the legislature itself may delegate powers to local governments. That's how we arrive at the process of local government through constitutional amendment. We have a constitutional amendment placing a bounty on beaver tails in Fayette County because the Constitution didn't grant local or state government the power to allocate funds for pest control. And we have another amendment undoing that one because the Constitution doesn't grant the authority or power to end its bounty when it became obvious residents of neighboring counties were crossing their borders to cash in. The Constitution also denies counties the power to levy property or income taxes. It denies planning and zoning authority, and it denies counties the ability to legislate local ordinances. With those powers absent from local government, one would think those powers are in the hands of the legislature, but even they struggle to maneuver within the Constitution's strict tax protocols. Because the state constitution makes the unorthodox decision to dictate tax maximums and earmark their purposes, the state is unable to reallocate or adjust revenue streams in times of financial crisis. The maximums are so specific they detail exceptions for specific cities and allocate their purpose in the founding document, which leaves no flexibility for fast responses to changing times. This stalemate of absolute maximums and earmarking is baked into our fundamental charter, and the result is multiple instances of the state working around itself to raid education funding in order to bail out its other departments. Some of the delegates at the convention were already experiencing this exact problem.
Etowah County has 3 delegates on the floor of this convention. And we 3 have agreed amongst ourselves, and we believe that we represent the people of Etowah County. We believe that we are doing what the people of Adela want when we include Adela in this list. 10 years ago, the city of Adela issued $50,000 worth of bonds, for which they received $45,000 in cash. With the $45,000, she built an electric light plant, a waterworks plant, and a public school. She paid the interest on those bonds for 1 or 2 years, and then she defaulted. Never since then has she paid any more interest. Today she belongs to the list of strangulated towns, and she has effected a compromise with the owners of those bonds. The city of Adela today has that electric light plant, that waterworks plant, and the public school. The proceeds of the money she received for these bonds. She comes here by her mayor and aldermen and many of her leading citizens and asks that her hands be untied. The people of Adela only ask that their hands be untied. Reconstitute, Alabama.
When it comes to education, the poll tax was specifically earmarked for schools, which in its design favored white votes and white dollars. Even the other property taxes earmarked for education stay within their particular community because the Bourbons feared local governments would make them pay for everyone's programs. This is how we get Madison City, Spain Park, and Hoover school systems alongside Hale County's K-12 building. The perverse part of this is the fundamental contradiction that tax money be spent in the community it comes from, but that same community has no control over raising or spending it. Notice how my examples of funded school systems are located in white suburban municipalities, and my example of an underfunded school came from the Black Belt counties. This is no coincidence, because through the formation of municipalities like villages, towns, and cities, the state grants more flexibility for home rule, such as leveraging some local sales taxes, which are themselves more burdensome for the poor because they spend more of their income each month. Unlike county governments, which are structured around the loose affiliation of elected officials, municipal governments have more determined power structures. In fact, the state constitution affords municipal governments 5 classes of powers based on the municipality's population, which allows for planning authority, some taxation, and the maintenance of public services. This is why our state boasts an extravagant number of tiny towns hovering around 300 residents. However, the structure of municipal governments are predetermined and inflexible. They still must seek constitutional amendment for moderate legislative solutions. They are unable to provide tax incentives or partnerships to stimulate business interests. And municipalities are still beholden to their congressional representatives. Furthermore, because the municipal commissions and powers are determined by population, residents have no say as to which home rule powers they claim. Even the incorporations of municipalities builds in an opportunity for racial discrimination. In order to incorporate, petitions must be presented to a probate judge with only 15% or more signatures from residents, as well as the signatures of over 60% of the area's landowners. This process places the power of incorporation in the hands of the landowning class and requires almost no consent from the people actually living there. To put this in a national context, Alabama is the only state in the U.S. where incorporation requires majority consent from landowners, and only 2 other states require any consent from landowners at all. Indiana requires a flat 50 landowning signatures, and Colorado requires 40 or 150 depending on population. Combine this landownership policy with the history of sharecropping and poverty in the Black Belt, and that means that black communities can't claim what few home rule rights the Constitution does afford. Affluent suburbs can therefore levy taxes and fund their school systems, while rural black communities are stuck with the pittance of power afforded to county systems. So how does anything get done? Congressional legislators. In theory, they represent their counties and communities, they advocate for local solutions, and reapportion themselves based on the federal census every 10 years. In reality, for more than 70 years of this Constitution's now 120-year regime, the state Congress refused to reapportion itself. 1900 to 1970 reflects a time in Alabama's history of great population redistribution. Our cities grew and industrialized as our economy moved away from the agrarian model that the Constitution reflects. Eventually, it came down to another case of federal intervention to force our legislature to reapportion itself. But not only were we electing representatives based on the 1900 census for more than half a century, the original apportionment grossly overrepresented the Bourbons of the Black Belt for two reasons. Representative districts stuck to county borders, giving each county the same representative weight in the House, and despite disenfranchising the majority of their constituency, the Black Belt maintained representation based on total population.
I desire to say to the convention that the report of this committee does the senatorial district that I have the honor to represent a gross injustice. In the first place, I contend that this constitutional convention is no place to fix representation. That is a matter that should be left to the General Assembly. But when I made that suggestion, I am confronted with the opposition that the Constitutional Convention of 1875 did embody it in their article. But the circumstances are entirely different. At that time, we were reforming the state government. We were adjusting ourselves to the circumstances of Reconstruction. We were beginning anew to build a house for our people to abide in. And, that being the case, it was necessary that we should form as many parts of it as possible. Reconstitute, Alabama.
Up to this point, I have explored how the issues of voting rights and local government structure restrict home rule, self-determination, and democracy in Alabama's local governments. But to fully understand how those lead to this, we need to move to Montgomery and discuss how our legislature functions in all of its glorious inefficiency. When a municipal or county government faces a problem beyond their powers to solve, which is all of them, they must bring the issue to their state representatives, which constitutes a small group of congressmen and senators that represent the locality's district. The group may then draft and propose a bill to be voted on by the legislature at large. However, if any individual representative opposes such legislation, they can trigger a process known as legislative courtesy. Legislative courtesy is essentially a veto power that prevents the issue from going to the floor of the state house or senate, and instead proposes the issue to a statewide popular referendum for constitutional amendment. Lee County, for example, is represented by 3 people in the Senate and 5 in the House, but only 3 of the 8 actually live in Lee County. Any one of these members can prevent the adoption of a local bill, and none of them may have a particular responsibility for the smooth functioning of county or municipal government. Where local constituents can rail against their county commissions to solve problems, any corporate lobbyist can buy a veto from a disinterested representative, and little to nothing can be done by the other representatives or constituents to override the veto. Now, whether or not the solution hits the floor of the state house or submits to a popular referendum, local governance has disappeared into statewide politics, where political apathy rules the day. Marion County might desperately need an increase in an office's salary, but those of us across the state can be counted on blindly voting against the increased expenditure of our taxes. Not only does this corrupt the nature of democratic representation, it slows the government's response to local problems to a standstill. Home rule cannot exist where local governance requires statewide consent. And this process is shown to be racially discriminatory. Interests of local governance in Black Belt counties are put through a statewide process of white approval. Black counties secure local constitutional amendments less frequently and less quickly than white counties, and often only after white counties have been afforded the same constitutional amendments. Rights to home rule start by a grueling process in white counties and trickle slowly down to black counties who must push through the same grueling process of legislative courtesy and popular referendum with no guarantee they will be afforded the same rights as the preceding white communities. Furthermore, vesting power in our individual representatives in Montgomery has corrupting effects. Montgomery has one of the highest densities of lobbyists per capita of any American city, and the centralization of power around the state house means that these corporate lobbyists maintain more access to our representatives than we do. This arrangement stunts grassroots activism and instead favors educating our representatives through corporate research rather than local testimony. To drive this point home, the halls of the State House were once so crowded with lobbyists, the legislature had to restrict deal-making to representatives' offices. Not that we can't trade money for votes, just that we can't do it in public.
Coming from the county of Lowndes, where there are 4,762 whites and 30,981 blacks, or 7 to 1, or more Negroes to the square mile than in darkest Africa, I am heartily in favor of a measure that will bring to our relief 20,000 white votes in the state for our redemption from ultimate ruin. The majority report embodies the best and most practicable ordinance, and I trust that it will be adopted. History repeats itself. I have seen in this historic hall 30 Negroes at one time, members of the legislature, selling their votes for a drink of whiskey or a mule, and enacting laws for us that inflicted millions of dollars of indebtedness on the state of Alabama, and which we are now paying and will have to pay and continue to pay for 50 years more as we have for the last 25 years. Under the present Constitution, they can come again. All they need is courage and leadership. All that we have is to prevent it is the indomitable pluck of Anglo-Saxon manhood. No white man who knows why this clause was adopted is going to offer sentimental objections to it. They are too level-headed, and they are in favor of white supremacy as far as the 15th Amendment will permit them to go. For a third of a century, the Negro has voted in Alabama, and always votes solidly against the interests and welfare of the state. I would rather have a military despotism than to be ruled by the Negroes and barbarism. Reconstitute Alabama.
The entire context of the 1901 convention was to impose white supremacy. From the remarks we have witnessed thus far, there can be no doubt about it. Home rule is an umbrella term that advocates for the right of self-determination by the constituents of local government. It intersects voting rights, governmental relations, congressional representation, and taxing efficiency. It has demonstrable effects on the prosperity of our communities, and we need to take home rule back, Alabama. Unfortunately, this isn't a problem that can be solved with legislation. Our legislative process is a symptom of the issue's root in the Constitution of our state, and no recompilation, editing, or organization of this document will undo its devastating effects that have played an extensive role in preventing black empowerment in the state and keeping African Americans under the heel of the white elite. The boundaries of this problem do not stop in the history books. It is a problem our communities face every day and for every year to come that this document continues to constitute our social structure. With that in mind, what change is necessary, and how do we solve this problem by empowering communities rather than squashing them? Joe Sumners, the director of the Economic and Community Development Institute at Auburn, has put forward a list of changes which I will reiterate here. 1. We need the option to establish alternative forms of county government. This could be a commission, a county council, or simply an elected county executive. 2. Counties should be able to choose among these options with only a local referendum, no statewide vote on how a distant community should govern themselves. 3. City and county governments should be able to write their own charters that provide government structures designed for the community they represent. 4. County and city governments should be able to consolidate into a single entity if they so choose. 5. Local governments must have the authority to adopt ordinances to protect public health, safety, and welfare. And even more importantly, they must be able to impose penalties for violations of their ordinances. 6. All cities and counties should have zoning authority and impose development impact fees that hold businesses accountable for their impact on the surrounding community. 7. Local government should be able to share their services if such services consolidation is in the interest of the public. 8. Counties should be able to reduce the number of elected department heads. And 9. All budgeting and management of local government funds should be consolidated at the level of the local government. These propositions address the issues of taxation, government structure, elections, and the stranglehold of the state house. If barriers to suffrage, restrictive local government structures, maximum taxation and earmarking, legislative courtesy, excess lobbying, and refusing to reapportion the legislature don't spell tyranny to you, then let me illustrate in full how this document was ratified. Recall how the Bourbons implemented voter fraud in the Black Belt to regain power at the end of the 1800s. They would position morally corrupt whites as vote counters, and they would tally all of the county's votes for the Democrats, regardless of whom the vote was intended. After the 1901 convention, pamphlets were distributed across the state for ratification that declared white supremacy, honest elections, and the new Constitution, one and inseparable. In order to ratify the new Constitution, a popular vote would be held using the much looser voting rules of the 1875 Constitution, which means that this would be the last Alabama election in which African Americans and poor whites would be able to participate for more than 50 years. 190,000 or so votes were cast, 108,000 were tallied in favor, and 81,000 were cast against. Now, the Black Belts applied more than 30,000 of the votes in favor, which means if we discount the Black Belts' votes, this Constitution would not have been ratified. Unless you are willing to suspend your disbelief such that the majority of African Americans in the Black Belt voted for a Constitution advertised as a means of implementing white supremacy, then this Constitution was never ratified. Over a century ago, the Bourbons stole our democracy and in so doing excluded from politics everyone but themselves. And while many pathways to voter registration have opened, the system is still designed in its fundamental structure to misrepresent us. Reconstitute, Alabama.